Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I really appreciate you being with me. We are continuing our study of the challenge of Christ. I have said this before. I'll undoubtedly say it again. It's literally stunning, to read some of the objections that people make. Recently, one fellow has been following me, persistently, dogging me, you might even say, and he's saying, the challenge of Christ is not relevant to us today. It was only relevant to the people who were there standing in front of Jesus in John chapter 10. I was like, so in other words, only if Jesus kept his word were the people standing around him to believe in him. But for us today, it's not important whether or not he kept his word. We're just supposed to believe in him anyway. I even asked him, this one particular individual, I said, okay, so the challenge of Christ is not relevant to us today, which ought to mean that when Paul said, writing in the 50s, 55, 6, 7, somewhere along in there. If Christ is not risen, now remind you, this is after Jesus was standing there. It's still in that generation, but it's written after Jesus was standing there in front of that hostile audience. And this fellow, remember, says, oh, that only applied to Jesus's audience. Okay. So here is Jesus saying, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe in me. And he said, do not believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my works. So it's whether or not he did what he said he was going to do that was and is supposed to gender faith. But not according to this individual. That only applied to them. But back to 1 Corinthians 15, here you have Paul saying, remember, writing to people who were not there in John chapter 10. Now that's still that generation. But the question therefore is, does this still apply today? Well, let's see. If Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain. If Christ is not risen, we are false witnesses. Let me ask you, since that didn't apply or doesn't apply today, does that mean our faith is in vain? Because, after all, that challenge only applied to Jesus's audience or even to the first century. We can have faith today whether or not he was raised from the dead. How many times have I said argumentum ad desperatum? Just simply unbelievable how desperate some people can be, how illogical some people can be. This is so far off the scale of logic, reason, and right thinking. Honestly, I don't know why I waste my time even responding to people like that. I have to tell you, because it's literally off the wall ridiculous. So, back to the challenge of Christ, which is still just as valid today as it was in the first century. We have the record of what Jesus said he was going to do. But according to this guy, it doesn't matter whether or not he did it. It only applied to people that heard him. See what I mean? Argumentum ad desperatum. Okay, all right. I've been sharing with you this concept of the Kairos, the divinely appointed time for the fulfillment of God's eschatological narrative and schema. John was told by the Father, who knew the day and the hour, blessed is he who reads, who understands, and keeps the words and the sayings of this book, because the time, Kairos, has come. what time, what divinely appointed time had arrived when John wrote. Notice he didn't say, the time will come by and by, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years away. He said 2,000 years ago, the time has come. Undeniably, he is saying the time, the appointed time for the fulfillment of biblical prophecy had come. I have illustrated that, real quick rehearsal here. I've illustrated this by pointing out that the book of Daniel uses the concept of the appointed time almost more than any other book. Daniel chapter 2, in the vision of the great beast, head of gold, chest of silver, etc., representing 4 kingdoms. The 4th kingdom, the days of Rome. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It shall be an everlasting kingdom that shall never be moved. Daniel 2:44. So here is a designated period of time, a divinely appointed period of time for the establishment of the kingdom. But that's not all. Some of my amillennial brethren, boy, they harp on Daniel 2:44. I mean to tell you, they go to town on it and say, see, the appointed time was the days of the Roman Empire, which of course is true. But they fail to see that the full establishment of the kingdom was not done on Pentecost. The foundation was laid. The chief cornerstone had been laid. And the apostles and prophets, who were the, foundation, was being laid, but the building wasn't completed. The kingdom had not fully come. People were being translated into that which was being built, Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, but it wasn't completed. So, then Daniel chapter 7, once again, 4 kingdoms. 4th kingdom being the days of Rome. In those days, now notice this is so critical as we correlate it with Daniel chapter 2. In the days of that 4th empire, i.e. the Roman Empire, the little horn would arise, persecute the saints. The Son of Man would come in judgment of the little horn, and there would be given unto him a kingdom, a dominion, and power, and authority that shall never be moved. A kingdom to be inclusive of all kindred and tongues and tribes and nations. And that would come when the Son of Man would come as the Ancient of Days and would destroy the little horn, and the kingdom would be given to the saints. Well, this is Daniel 2:44. When would it take place? Days of the 4th kingdom. But what happens? In the futurist paradigms, they say, well, yeah, Daniel 2:44, that's been fulfilled. Daniel chapter 7, 15 and following hasn't been fulfilled because Christ hasn't come. The Antichrist hasn't come yet. We're waiting for the Antichrist to be fully manifested. I was raised in the worldview that said the Antichrist was the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. And thus, at the end of time, Christ will come and destroy the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. So you see how they delineate between Acts 2:44 and, Daniel 2:44 and Daniel chapter 7. It's just not tenable, ladies and gentlemen. It just doesn't work. You have to remove Daniel chapter 7, 15 and following from the days of Rome, because guess what? We're not in the days of Rome. Rome ceased to exist in 476 AD, and it's not going to be restored. So that means that you've got to be able to find fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7 within the days of historical Rome, not a restored Rome, and on it goes. And so we've come to Daniel chapter 9, and I have pointed out to you how Daniel was told 70 weeks are determined. From the Hebrew word katak, which means here's the flow of history, here's the flow of time, and God in his sovereignty said, okay, I'm going to cut it out from here to here. That's the divinely appointed time. To do what? To put away sin, to make the atonement. And now we come to an absolutely fascinating term, to finish the transgression. By the way, I think I've said enough about the concept of making the atonement, pointing out that the New Testament writers, in speaking of the coming of Christ, that he came to make the atonement. That was in the first century. So we move on to this intriguing term, to finish the transgression. All down through history, noted historians, noted linguists, noted Christian commentators have said and acknowledged what is at stake here is the concept of the filling up of the measure of sin. Boy, this is rich. Now, in my book, 70 Weeks Are Determined for the Resurrection, I discuss this concept of finishing the transgression in great detail. I show you how Hebraic linguists have defined the term. How even the early church writers that so many people rely upon, and the inconsistencies are glaring, but they tell us, look, Preston, none of the early church writers were preterists, therefore you can't be a preterist. Therefore preterism is false. But what do they do on other occasions? Well, we just can't take what the early church writers said. Even though they said finish the transgression meant to fill up the measure of sin, and it was fulfilled in the first century when the Jews filled up the measure of their sin. All of a sudden they shift gears and say, I don't really accept what the patristics said on that. So you do accept what they say about the coming of the Lord being future, but you deny what they have to say on filling up the measure of sin, i.e. finishing the transgression. So while futurists accuse preterists of cherry-picking quotes from the preterist and saying, well, look, here is Tertullian, or here's Chrysostom, or here's Athanasius, or even Ignatius, whatever, even though they made comments that are supportive of the full preterist view. See, we can't accept that. But we can accept the fact that they turned around and said the coming of the Lord is still future. See the inconsistency? Why should we accept one and not the other? Doesn't make any sense. Okay, I've got to go on. So we have this concept of the filling up of the measure of sin. Now, let me make the observation again, because this is important. Many commentators, including the noted commentator John Collins, says that Daniel chapter 9 was written during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And it foretold the filling up of the measure of Israel's sin at that particular time, and thus the judgment of Daniel 9 fell upon them. Now, remember, you've really, really got to catch the power of this. John Collins does not believe that there's anything such as literal, verbal, plenary inspiration through the Holy Spirit. As a matter of fact, in commenting on Daniel chapter 11, John Collins says the way that we know that Daniel chapter 11 was written at a period of time, in which Antiochus Epiphanes was living and active, this so-called Daniel, it really wasn't Daniel, okay, not really. So, but nonetheless, calling him Daniel, but the way that we know that Daniel made a true prophecy is because his prophecy failed. Now, there's a criteria of authenticity for you, isn't it? The way that we know a, quote, prophet failed is only if his prophecy failed. That turns Deuteronomy chapter 18 and following, completely upside down. If any prophet speaks a word in my name, and I have not spoken to him, if that word does not come to pass, he has spoken presumptuously, and you shall not fear him. So the test of a true prophet was whether or not his prophecy came true. Isaiah 43, Isaiah 44, Isaiah challenged, here's the challenge of Yahweh. Challenged the prophets of the Baal pantheon, Astarte, etc., etc. Bring forth your strong reasons. Tell us what shall be hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. And so here's Isaiah, living 150 years before, for instance, Cyrus ever lived. And he calls Cyrus by name, remember, 150 years before Cyrus ever lived. So do you know what the skeptical scholars have to do? You know what they're forced to say? Well, Isaiah didn't really write that. This is a later prophet. This is a later guy who lived during the time of Cyrus. So do you see the desperation of these modern scholars? The only way that they can support their views is just simply tear the Bible completely apart, deny everything it says, ascribe many of the writings to frauds and to fakes, and say, now we understand the Bible. But if we accept Jesus' statement that Isaiah was a prophet of God, speaking by the Spirit, then we have Isaiah written 150 years before Isaiah or before Cyrus ever came on the scene, telling us that Cyrus would come and allow the inhabitants of Jerusalem to go back home after the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, folks, that's absolutely incredible. I mean, that truly is incredible. So all of that brings us to the concept that Daniel chapter 9 foretold the filling up of the measure of Israel's sin. Well, once again, Collins says Daniel was talking about the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So we have two concepts going on here. The question of whether or not Daniel was written during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and spoke of what would happen in Israel during that time, or whether or not Daniel was genuinely a prophet and spoke of the ultimate filling up of the measure of Israel's sin and her final destruction. So how do we determine which is true? Well, here's a point of fact. A point of fact is that according to Daniel chapter 8, which is unequivocally a discussion of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But you see, all that we have to do is to take Daniel chapter 9 as an inspired prophecy of the future, predicting the yet future time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But in addition to that prophecy, you find Daniel chapter 9 going far beyond the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and speaking of Jesus' generation, which we know from Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, speaking to his apostles, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then let those who are in Judea flee. So do you know what the commentaries do on that? Well, Daniel didn't really predict what Jesus was speaking about. He was actually speaking of the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. So what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 24 was, now, when you see something happen in Judea that resembles what Daniel was talking about, i.e. in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, then you need to get out. But that's not what the language says. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. Now, Daniel chapter 12 spoke of the abomination at the time of the end, at the time of the resurrection, at the time of the Great Tribulation, which Jesus unequivocally posited for the first century. Now, I've written some good deal on this in regard to the Great Tribulation and whether that occurred in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com, and just type in Antiochus Epiphanes Great Tribulation in the search bar, and you'll find a couple of articles that I've written on this. Folks, this is incredible. So, there's such a tremendous amount that we can say on this, but let me see if I can bring it back into sharp focus. Was Daniel 9 speaking of the time of Israel filling up the measure of sin in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, again, Daniel chapter 8 definitely speaks of the fact that in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, Israel would fill up the measure for sin. Daniel chapter 8, 23 and following. When the transgressors have come to the full, God would bring Antiochus Epiphanes to bring judgment on them. Okay, does that mean that Daniel 9 was speaking of that event? No, for a number of reasons. Daniel 9 says, at the time of this filling up of the measure of sin, Messiah the Prince, and he said, in the midst of the week, Messiah, the anointed one, shall be cut off, but not for himself. Well, you see, once again, men like John Collins and former preterist Sam Frost says, yeah, well, that Messiah there is Onias, the high priest that we've been talking about lately. Well, Daniel chapter 9, verse 26 has this Messiah, the prince, being cut off, but not for himself. Listen, folks, listen. This is the propitiation death of this prince. The atonement death of this prince. The substitutionary death of this prince. So ask yourself the question. Did Onias the fourth die a substitutionary death on behalf of Israel? No one ever said that he did. None of the ancient writers, to my knowledge, maybe I missed something, none of the ancient Jewish writers ever say that he did. Now, was he considered a righteous man? Yes, he was. Did they say that he died for the people? Not that I'm aware of. And again, I may have missed something. That's always possible. But Daniel 9 verse 26 is very clear. In the middle of the week, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Now, unfortunately, my dispensational friends literally butcher this text and have it say he shall be cut off and have nothing for himself. I'm sorry, that is not what the text says. So back to the issue. Daniel chapter 9 has the death of this prince on the behalf of someone else. It's a propitiatory death. It is an atonement death. Remember, Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are determined to make the atonement. Folks, when Jason and Menelaus became high priests, they could not make the atonement. They're disqualified. That doesn't fit Daniel 9. But Jesus could certainly make the atonement. Now watch this. When you apply Daniel chapter 9 to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, yes, it can be argued without any doubt whatsoever that at that time And the very reason for Antiochus Epiphanes was because Israel had filled up the measure of their sin. At that time, the transgressors will come to the full. No one's denying that. Okay, but here's where it really comes down. This is where Antiochus Epiphanes is disqualified and excluded from Daniel chapter 9. At that time, Messiah the Prince shall be cut off, and the city and the sanctuary shall be destroyed. Now, I want to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, and you really, really, really have to catch the power of this. The time of Antiochus Epiphanes was, without a doubt, a horrific time in Israel's history. I make no qualms about it. I have no reservations about it. It was stunningly bad. Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to wipe out the Jewish religion. He wanted to obliterate the Jewish religion. But here's a fact that you cannot miss. This is a fact pointed out by many scholars. Daniel 9 is emphatic that as a result of this Messiah being cut off, but not for himself, the city and the sanctuary shall be destroyed. Here is an irrefutable, undeniable, historical fact. The city of Jerusalem was not destroyed by Antiochus Epiphanes. Fact number one. The temple at Jerusalem was not destroyed by Antiochus Epiphanes. Irrefutable, undeniable. The temple was defiled, it was desecrated, it was not destroyed. Now I'm out of time, so I'm going to pick up on this next week, but you have to catch those realities. So I'll see you next week.